Dave, welcome to Toronto Mic'd.
Thanks for having me on the show, Mike. I've watched several of your shows, including the one that you did with Russ Taylor's daughter. And I got a big kick out of that, listening to some of the tapes you played, and it was a lot of fun. So I've looked forward to this meeting with you.
Well, Russ Taylor's daughter, Leslie, is actually, we're going to hear from her in this episode. She's recorded something I'm going to play for you shortly. But
Okay.
let me tell the Expos heads listening out there that there is an episode 1056 of Toronto Mic'd, and Danny Gallagher was my special guest, and we did about 95 minutes on the history of the Montreal Expos. So if your ears were burning, it's because we mentioned your name quite a bit in that episode.
Okay. I'll be sure to check it out.
Check it out. And shout out to Danny Gallagher. He's always sharing the history of the Expos, and you're a big part of that. How's retirement treating you? How is life?
Very good. Everything's well here. A little on the muggy side in South Florida, but I'm not complaining about that. It's uh, it's in the 80s today. Yesterday and the day before it was in the 90s, and so it's a little too hot to go out and ride the bike or go for walks. But I'm doing just fine. Thank you.
I love that you ride a bike. I'm a big cycling advocate, as is Leslie Taylor. She's biking everywhere as well. But it's great that you get out there. What kind of rides are you doing? Like along the water? Where are you going for a bike ride these days?
Well, there are times I go along the water, but usually I'm about 11 miles west of the ocean. So usually I'm going past inland lakes and waterways and canals and so forth. But I try to get out and go for at least 5 to 10 miles on a good day. Some days when it's just too hot, I'll do a couple of miles and call it a day.
Well, no shame in that. That sounds amazing. That's awesome. Sounds like you're enjoying retirement. Well deserved. We're going to kind of walk through your career, the history of the Expos. I do have some recordings, not just from Leslie, but other listeners who were very excited that you're making your Toronto Mike debut. I'm sorry it took so long. This is because of I think my Blue Jay bias got in the way, and it took me a while to get to you, but I'm honored you're carving out some time for me today.
Well, as Expos, we have fought the Blue Jays bias since they came into the American League. So this is nothing new for us.
We'll touch on that. I'm going to play a clip from Brian Gerstein, who is a devoted listener of this program. Brian, I hope to see you at TMLX 15 on June 27th at Great Lakes Brewery. And I have your Toronto Maple Leafs baseball book for you that I'm going to bring for you. But Dave, this is Brian.
Dave, you are literally the soundtrack of my youth, hanging on every one of your eloquent words broadcasting Expos games. I carried your voice around with me everywhere I went, mainly via the medium of radio, where you did your best work. You were my Vin Scully, and us Expos fans were so fortunate to have a Hall of Famer recognized in both St. Mary's and Cooperstown calling Expos games. This is just a note of appreciation for especially making my summers that much more enjoyable in the Laurentians. Thank you.
How does it
Well,
feel?
I thank you. I'm thrilled whenever I hear from those that followed the Expos back in the day, and of course, those days were over the period of 32 years that I broadcast Expos baseball, and before moving to South Florida. So that was a wonderful time of my life. I wish it hadn't ended, and I know that there are a lot of Expos fans that wish there was some way to bring the team back. It's a long, hard battle, and I don't know whether a whole lot of progress has been made, but we're all hoping for the best.
Let's keep our fingers crossed on that one. I'd love to hear the story of how you were hired by the Montreal Expos for their inaugural season in 1969. But first, before you tell that story, I'm curious, Dave, when did you fall in love with baseball? Like, when did you know this was your calling?
Well, my father, uh, who was born and raised in Boston, took us often from our hometown in Easton, Pennsylvania, up to Massachusetts for vacations when we were kids, my brother and I. And he started, along with his brother, my uncle Walter, taking me to games at both the Red Sox facility at Fenway Park and the Braves field where the Boston Braves played. So I got to see introduced Major League Baseball up in Boston, where there were two big league teams, started collecting baseball cards, and the rest is history.
But when did you realize you had the pipes for this? I'm listening to you in my headphones now, and I'm going, oh, no wonder he called baseball games. Like, he's got the timbre and everything. When did you realize, oh, I can do this? I can call a baseball game.
Well, I think that happened a little bit later. When I was in college, I was at RPI, which is Richmond Professional Institute. You would know it as VCU, Virginia Commonwealth University. That's where I went to school and studied radio and television and voice and diction. And I was told several times during my tenure there that I had a chance to do this. One day there was a notice posted on the department bulletin board asking for some of the male members of the drama department to come down and audition for a radio show. And so 4 or 5 of us went down there, auditioned for a radio show. I got a phone call from the general manager of the station, said, we'd like you to do a show for us. And that was the start of my radio career in Richmond, Virginia.
I think I need to go to that school to learn about diction. You know, this is Dave, I think this was my great mistake. I never did learn diction. So good on you for getting the baseline there. And then how do you, because the Expos arrive in 1969, just a few years before I arrive. Now, how did you get the gig with the Expos?
Well, I'll give you the Reader's Digest version because we don't have time enough in one day to go through the whole routine. But I was in Richmond, Virginia, broadcasting minor league baseball. The Richmond Braves, the Atlanta Braves AAA club, had moved to Richmond in 1966, and I was one of the broadcasters on their games in 66, 67, and 68. Long about 68, I knew baseball was what I wanted to turn my career attention to. And so I started applying a few times. I got a couple of invitations to go for interviews in Cincinnati and in Baltimore and in Washington, D.C., and nothing was coming my way. So when the league announced expansion in 1968, I immediately applied to Montreal. I scoured all of the books and magazines, and I couldn't find who owned the club. As a matter of fact, I would find out later, nobody owned the club. It was in the hands of Mayor Jean Drapeau and several of his councilmen, including Jerry Snyder. So I wrote a letter to Jerry Snyder and never heard back from him. And so now it's late in 1968, and I still haven't heard a word. And a friend of mine, Lou Martin, who was a Richmond baseball guy, was hired by John McHale to go up to Montreal and oversee the construction of Jarry Park. And one day, John McHale and several other executives were up there to check on the progress being made on Jarry Park during the winter of 68, 69. And John said, I've got to find a broadcaster. He said, I've hired Russ Taylor here, a Montreal broadcaster, and Russ is on board, but I'd like to bring somebody in from the United States that has done baseball. And a voice from the back seat of the car, Lou Martin's voice, said, well, I can save you the trouble. John said, well, I've got 139 applications for the job, and I don't have time to go through 139 applications. And Lou Martin said, well, I can save you the trouble. He said, talk to Dave Van Horne in Richmond. He's doing the Richmond Braves games. So that led to an invitation to meet with John McHale. And I met with him in West Palm Beach during spring training of 69. And I came back to Richmond not knowing whether I had the job or not. And we were getting ready to head into the basketball tournament season. And I was doing basketball as well. And the station manager said, Dave, are you going to be here for basketball or are you going to be off doing baseball games? And I said, well, I don't know. He said, well, I have to know. So I picked up the phone and I called Montreal, got a hold of Ray Blomquist, who John had hired to oversee the radio end of things. And I said, Ray, I don't want to push you on this and jeopardize my chances, but if I've got a chance for this job, I need to know something so I can notify them here in Richmond. He said, I'll call you back in 5 minutes. Well, the first thing that went through my mind when I got off the phone was, I'm never going to hear from them again. And certainly in 5 minutes, the phone rang again. It was Ray. And he said, I've got some news for you. I said, okay, good. What is it? He said, you can tell your boss in Richmond that you won't be doing basketball in the month of April because on April 8th, you'll be at Shea Stadium in New York broadcasting the Expos' first game and joining Russ Taylor as our radio broadcast team. And that's how I found out I had that job.
Wow. Okay. So we're going to get back to Russ Taylor in just a moment when I play a clip from his daughter. But I'm going to play one more clip at this point from Brian, who actually, he's my co-host for this episode. You don't see him here, but I want to play this for you and get your response to this.
Sliding doors question for you, Dave. At the end of the 68 season, after calling games for the Richmond Braves AAA team, you sent out 2 applications, one to Kansas City and one to Montreal. Was Kansas City a realistic option for you? Did you get an interview with them even? And how would your career have played out had you gone there instead of Montreal?
It's a good question, Brian, but I can't answer it because I never heard back from Kansas City. So I never heard from them, and several other places where I had applied during the late 50s. Cincinnati, at least I heard back from them. And they said we don't want to bring you in for baseball, but we'll bring you in. We'll offer you a job as a newsreader here in Cincinnati, and that didn't appeal to me. Perhaps it should have, but it didn't. So I passed on that. I passed on an opportunity for a meeting at WTOP in Washington, D.C. for the senator's job. And I passed on an opportunity to meet with the Baltimore Orioles for the Oriole job because I was really hoping to get this job with the expansion team, the Montreal Expos. And as it turned out, I got that job.
And what is that like being, there on the ground floor for day one of a brand new Major League Baseball franchise and the first franchise outside the United States? Like, what is that like?
Well, I've told this story many times, so I'll tell it again, particularly in light of the fact that Leslie's going to be a part of the show here today.
Yeah, she'll be next, so she's on deck.
Yeah, it was such a whirlwind thing because after I turned my notice in Montreal, I had to get on a flight to, in Richmond, I had to get on a flight to Montreal and go up and sort of sign in, get into the books and meet with them up there and meet Russ. And so I did that. And then I went back to Richmond knowing that I had to just pack up and then Russ and I were going to meet the team over in the Tampa Bay area because they'd broken camp in West Palm Beach. So it was really near the end of spring training when I was hired. And Russ and I met up in Tampa Bay and watched a couple of exhibition games over there. Then we headed out. Major League Baseball had an idea for the new Expos. Let's send them from Richmond to Tampa Bay, from Tampa Bay to Omaha, Nebraska, and we'll have them play a couple of exhibition games in Omaha. Then they'll make their way back into Milwaukee, and they'll do a couple of exhibition games in Milwaukee. Then they'll fly to New York and open their regular season and play that first game on April 8th. So that was my introduction to Major League travel, the challenges of the Major League schedule. And Russ and I kind of shook our heads and said, boy, this is some kind of welcome to the big leagues, isn't it? We're all over the country to finally wind up in New York for the first game.
Now, Russ has 3 children, one of whom I should you probably know this, David, one of whom is a very famous comedian in this country, Carolyn Taylor. She's been on this program. She's very funny. And then he's got a son who I have not yet had the pleasure of meeting, and a daughter, Leslie, who comes out to all the Toronto Mic'd events and has become a good friend. So let's hear from Leslie, and then after we address her question, we'll hopefully talk a little bit more about her father, Russ.
Okay.
Hi, Dave, it's Leslie Taylor. First, I want to say thanks for answering my DM on Twitter and agreeing to come on Mike's podcast. Many of his listeners, if you haven't heard already, you most certainly will. We're big fans of yours and the Expo, so I was happy to be able to connect you with Mike. So my questions are more personal than professional. So firstly, coming from the US, what was it like to be dropped into a majority French speaking city like Montreal? Had you ever even been to Montreal before? And then my second question is about your kids. I fondly remember the times our family spent with yours over the years, since my brother and I were all around the same age as your boys. So I was wondering what they're all up to these days. Thanks.
Oh, it's great to hear from Leslie. That's wonderful. Let's see. Let's tackle the last one first, the kids.
Sure.
My boys are kind of scattered. The youngest, Dwayne, is here in Palm Beach County. He's the manager of the PODS facility in Palm Beach County. And up in Baltimore, my son, Jim, the oldest, he is living in Baltimore now for, I don't know, probably 15 or 20 years. And my grandson is up there in Baltimore with him, and they work in home reconstruction. And then up in Sabatus, Maine, out in the middle of nowhere in the state of Maine, my son Jeff is up there with his family. And unfortunately, David Jr., who was born in 1960. David was in the Army. He was an image interpreter. He traveled the world doing work for the United States Army intelligence. A lot of times I wouldn't know where he was, but I'd get a call from him before he left, said, I'll be gone for a while, so don't try to get a hold of me. But Chip came down with diabetes, and diabetes took his life about 8 years ago, and we miss him terribly. And so that's the story of the boys, and they're all doing well. And thank you for asking.
I'm sorry for your loss, Dave. I just want to share my condolences with you. That's sorry to hear that.
Well, I appreciate that. He was a very wonderful son. He was dedicated to the United States Army until he came down with diabetes and was forced to leave. And he tried to put his life together as best he could, and he did a good job of that while his health allowed him to. But he passed away down in Texas after a long battle with diabetes.
Now, difficult segue, I suppose, but Montreal, very, very French. My daughter lives there during the school year. She goes to McGill University there, and she's fluent in French. It's easy for her, but I suspect your French was a little rusty, pun intended there. But what's it like?
Well, I'll tell you, it's been written a few times that after I got the news that I had the job in Montreal, that I had to go to the Atlas and look and see where Montreal was. That's not true. I did look at the Atlas to see how far away it was, and saw, of course, that it was just over the border north of New York City. And but I didn't know a thing about the language issues or the politics of Montreal, Quebec, or Canada. I had vacationed there with my parents, driven through Montreal on the way to Quebec City and the eastern townships, because my father was born in New Brunswick. He's not a Canadian. He went to the United States with his parents, and he's an American who passed away 1 year before I got my job with the Expos. And so Dad took us down to the Maritimes several times on family vacations. but it was always just passing through Montreal. I'm going to cut to the Expos side of that story. I was so fortunate, and didn't know it at the time, but I sure found out quickly, to have Russ Taylor as my partner, because Russ took me through Montreal history, the baseball history in Montreal and in Quebec and across Canada, and took me into the political situations that we were dealing with at the time in the late 50s, early 60s in Montreal. And I would not have been as comfortable as I was had I been on my own trying to piece all that together. But I had Russ Taylor at my side, and he was a wonderful friend and a wonderful teacher, and guided me through everything that I needed to know about not just Montreal, but Quebec and Canada.
Now, you, Dave, you're in the Canadian Baseball Hall of Fame.
Yes.
Congratulations on that. Now, I've been doing work lately with the Toronto Maple Leafs baseball team that plays at Christie Pitts. In fact, I'm there on Sunday recording live, and I've got to know the good people at the Canadian Baseball Hall of Fame.
Mm-hmm.
So my question for you, and this in a future episode, this may be revisited, but in your opinion, should Russ Taylor be in the Canadian Baseball Hall of Fame?
Absolutely. I've made that case with my fellow members on many occasions. Every year I have him on my ballot. Russ, of course, had well established himself as a sportscaster in Montreal long before the Expos got there. He did Montreal Royals work. He worked at Delorme Downs. He was well versed in the baseball history of Quebec, and had it not been for Russ and his insistence that Bill Giles, the president of the league, and John McHale go to this ballpark that was situated up at Jarry Park and see if that would serve as a place where a temporary major league facility could be built. And Russ, of course, went along for the ride when they went up there and looked at it. Indeed, the discovery of Jarry Park through Russ Taylor paved the way for the Expos to stay in Montreal, because anybody that lived through that time period remembers all the rumors. They're going to move them to Buffalo. They're going to move them here, there, or somewhere else. They're not going to be able to hold on to this franchise. That was before they'd ever played a game or put a team together. Right. And Russ saved the day with that idea that Jarry Park, which was a very small little ballpark, sat probably 2,000 people behind home plate, but it was a baseball field, and it could be expanded into the massive Jarry Park that we know today, where the tennis center is. And Russ said, this is a place that you could put up a temporary ballpark, which they did, and it was a huge success.
Okay, I'm sold. Now we're gonna have to revisit this at some point, because now I'm angry, Dave. We gotta get Russ Taylor in the Canadian Baseball Hall of Fame. But thank you.
Yeah, I'm with you.
Okay,
I'm with you. As I said, I have him on my ballot every year. I've talked to other members and said you've got to give greater consideration to Russ, and I won't give up on that until he justifiably enters the Canadian Baseball Hall of Fame.
Okay, we'll continue this conversation later. That's a teaser. I'll say that's a teaser for the listenership that we're not done with this particular topic, to be continued. But I'm curious. You mentioned the Montreal Royals, and I know a couple of your partners in the booth were former members of the Montreal Royals. I'm going to start with Jackie Robinson. Like, so you shared the booth with Jackie Robinson for a season, right?
For 2 games.
2 games. Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
See, this is my Blue Jays bias.
For 2 games. Okay. John McHale brought Jackie in to do a couple of games back in the early days on TV. Okay. And that was a wonderful experience for all of us to spend a little bit of time with Jackie. That was in August of 1972. I'm searching for the right year, but I think that's it.
I think that's
And actually, it was only a couple of months before his untimely death after a long battle with diabetes.
Oh my goodness. Yeah. Now, it's funny how I saw it was 1972, and in my imagination, this is just before I, showed up on this wonderful planet of ours. But 2 games, that's amazing with Jackie Robinson, and I hope you can tell me a bit about sharing the booth with Duke Snider.
Well, that was a great experience for me. I was blessed with good partners all along the way, starting, of course, with Russ. Don Drysdale came into the booth for 1 year on television. My first year doing TV, Don Drysdale was my partner. He had pitched in Montreal. Of course, Dodger manager Tommy Lasorda had played there. And then along came Duke. And right before Duke in 71, I'm going to say, we had a situation where John was having trouble bringing people in to work as the analyst on the schedule of games that were on TV. There weren't that many. We were only doing 18 to 20, 24 games a year on television in the early days. But Pee Wee Reese also came in, and I worked 12 games with Pee Wee Reese. And then Duke and I, of course, were together for close to 15 years. So that was a wonderful time, and I was blessed in all those early years to have wonderful partners who were great storytellers, had tremendous recall. Each one of them could go back to games that I would bring up or situations I would bring up, and they remembered the ball strike count, how many outs, what the score was, and what their part in that game was. And it just blew me away that these ex-players had the memory of the games that they played in the big leagues that was etched firmly into their brains.
Now, I took note when I was doing that deep dive into the history of the Expos with Danny Gallagher that, unlike with the Blue Jays, we don't have a Tim Linder-Carter, we don't have a Touch 'Em All Joe, but I'm going to play a little clip and talk about one season in particular. So let's listen to this.
A lazy fly ball to left. Francona went back. Will he get to it? He does. There it is. Expos win the second half. The whole team out on the field. Look at the celebration out there. My goodness. What a ball game.
So 1981, that's the first time the Montreal Expos win the pennant. Would you mind?
Yep.
Share a little bit about just 81. I know how it ends. I might play that clip too, just a trigger warning for the Expos fans. But could you tell me a little bit about the 81 season?
Well, the first memory that comes to me, other than postseason in 81, was earlier in the year when there was a strike. And the players went out for, I think it was 55 days before coming back and resuming the season. And when the season resumed, it was referred to as the second half. And of course, the Expos won the second half title and went on to the playoffs. I remember, of course, the 5-game league championship series, which would have resulted in a World Series appearance for the Expos, but the Dodgers got in the way on infamous Blue Monday and won that game, and the Expos came so close that year, and it turned out to be until just a couple of years ago, what was it, 2020, when they made it for the second time to the playoffs. But 81, marred by the player strike, but we picked up, and everybody was really excited about the way the team played in that second half to win that second half title, and then go on to the league championship series, which would have paved the way to the World Series, only to lose on the last day, Blue Monday.
Well, let me play that clip, maybe. I'm sorry. Let me play the Blue Monday. Just, I'm contractually obligated to play it, and then we'll kind of talk about that moment. And again, I am a Blue Jay fan, but I remember the end of the 1987 season, and I can tell you recently our playoff appearances have been rather painful. But let's play the famous Rick Monday home run game here.
Now in the stretch. Here's the 3-1 pitch, and it's swung on, fly ball, center field. Dawson going back onto the warning track. Dawson at the wall. That ball is a home run. That ball is out of here, and a home run for Rick Monday, and the Dodger bench clears to congratulate Rick Monday, who's hit a 2-out home run here in the 9th inning, and it appeared that Andre Dawson had room as he went back to the fence, and he just flat ran out of room as the ball cleared the fence at about the 385 mark.
Well, as we mentioned, Ron, Rick Monday, a fastball hitter in that situation. Steve had to come in with a fastball. He hit it hard. He hit it to center field, the deepest part of the field. Andre went back on it. Thought he had a chance, but it just cleared the fence.
A 9th inning home run. And the Dodgers have gone ahead 2-1.
My goodness, Dave, listening to that now, I'm heartbroken here again, all over again. So close yet so far. But what was that like?
Yeah. Well, Duke and I were working the game on TV. That was the radio broadcast with Ron Rouge and Tommy Hutton.
Who was your
Tommy's
partner
still,
too? Yeah, sorry.
No, I was just going to say Tommy's still working in baseball as one of the analysts on the Marlins games. Excuse me.
So what's
so that
like?
was the that was the radio broadcast, and I remember things had gone so well for the Expos. I remember during the commercial break after the top of the 9th inning, Duke and I being in agreement that, that might not be the end of this game, because this team has played so well and they've got a lot of the right people coming up in the bottom of the 9th inning. They can still pull this out. We were very optimistic heading into the bottom of the 9th that the team would pull it out. So the shock of the Monday home run really didn't set in with Van Horne and Snyder until the game was over.
Wow. Yeah. And man, I got to ask you a question now. I don't even quite understand the context. So actually, Dave, I'm hoping you'll explain this. But okay. So Tim writes in when you were coming on and said, ask him how he felt when Claude Brochu gave the color commentary job to Joe Cannon. Would you mind sharing who is Joe Cannon for those of us who are pleading ignorance, and why was this decision controversial in any regard?
Well, Joe was a longtime Montreal broadcaster, talk show host, and did a wonderful job. And he went to school back in the day with Claude Brochu. They'd been lifelong friends. And so when the opening came about, Claude took the shortcut and asked Joe if he wanted to do the games. And he had never done play-by-play or analyzed baseball games before, and so John put him in that position. And it might have been that Joe could have been a part of the broadcast somehow, but probably not as the analyst.
Interesting. Okay, so now I understand completely that Joe Cannon was a fine broadcaster, but maybe lacked the depth of knowledge you might require to be, an analyst for a baseball game.
Well, in all of the years prior to that, the bar had been set pretty high when you consider Don Drysdale and Pee Wee Reese and Duke Snyder for all those years, and Gary Carter, and even Jim Fanning, when it was a surprise to us at the time that Claude asked Jim Fanning to go into the radio booth, which he did for a few years. But Jim was a baseball man, and he knew the game, and he knew the players, he knew the system, and so we never really looked back on that. But anyway, that's the way it all went down.
Sometimes it's who you know, right, Dave?
Well, that's true. And that was the case for me to get the job. As I told you, I knew Lou Martin from Richmond, and it was Lou Martin who said to John McHale, talk to Dave Van Horne, at a moment when John was shuddering at the thought of having to go through 130 some applications for that job.
Right. Now, spoiler alert, at some point you do leave the Expos. Before the Expos leave Montreal, you leave the Expos and you start broadcasting games for the Marlins, and you're lucky enough that you get to call a World Series championship in Florida. But before you leave Montreal, I have some more Expos questions for you, particularly in your opinion, just with Montreal, not with the Marlins. Dave, what would you say was your most memorable call while with the Montreal Expos?
That's a difficult question to answer. I don't know that I can respond to that. I'm sure a lot of fans, and not unfortunately, I shouldn't say that, but I was doing TV the day that Dennis Martinez pitched his perfect game. And I had a call at the end of that game that a lot of people remember, El Presidente, El Perfecto. And because of the wonderful pitching job that Dennis did that day, my call has survived, and I still hear it every now and then on various outlets. So that was probably the one that stays with me the most. But I was fortunate enough for a 16-year period to watch the Expos win more games than any other National League team in that 16-year period. And so it's hard to pick out any one game or any one finish or series, but that was a wonderful time. So that was half of the 32 years that I spent in Montreal. So the calls, I know early in our broadcast careers, both Russ and I, we were kind of feeling our way through. I never said up, up, and away for the first 2 or 3 years, and we were both trying to find our niche as baseball broadcasters. And one night driving home from Jerry Park, I was thinking about this, and I was thinking, Russ and I, our calls at the end of games, winning or losing, are so similar. I should probably come up with something. And about that time, I heard on the radio the song "Up, Up and Away." Marilyn McCoo and Billy Daniels, is it? Anyway, I heard that song and I said, "Up, Up and Away, that might work." And so I thought about it for a few days, and then I've forgotten what the date was that I finally used the call on the radio. And I used it for a week or two, and I thought, well, I haven't heard any feedback on this at all. I'll just go back to manufacturing my own finish to at-bats and games. And when I did stop, John McHale came to me and he said, "Why have you stopped using up, up, and away?" And I said, "Well, I didn't think anybody was reacting to it." He said, "Well, I'm reacting to it, and I want you to go back to it right now." And I did.
Smart move. All right. So you mentioned this call. You've often hear it at different outlets, and here's another outlet that's going to make you hear it again. So let's just listen to that call you were talking about. Dennis Martinez' perfect game.
In the bottom of the ninth, 26 in a row have been retired by Dennis Martinez. One and two pitch. In the air. Center field. Grissom. El Presidente. El Perfecto. Martinez with a perfect no-hit, no-run ball game, and the Expos have beaten the Dodgers 2-0. What a tremendous reaction.
I love the restraint you show on that call, in that you have that memorable call, and then you just let the crowd go for, I didn't time it, but it felt like a minute or so, and it just makes it perfect. No wonder people keep replaying that call.
It was a moment that belonged to Dennis. Now, to remind those who didn't see that on television, that was a television game, and they were seeing the celebration on the field. They were seeing Dennis Martinez. And Duke and I always felt the same way about that game in particular, and others as well. Those moments belong to the player, not to the broadcaster. So once I got that final call in on that catch by Grissom, we just sat back and looked at each other and shook our heads, and it was just a marvelous moment. And the way that the Dodger fans treated Dennis and the Expos that day, it sounded like a home game.
Ah, yes.
The crowd was just terrific, and the appreciation they showed to Dennis. Of course, if you're a Dodger fan and have been for a few years, you have a great appreciation for great pitching. This is the team that had Don Drysdale and Sandy Koufax and Don Sutton and so many other wonderful pitchers. They were used to wonderful moments on the mound, and they paid tribute to Dennis with that long standing ovation that he received as the Expos won that game.
So let me ask you this, Dave. If that was a radio broadcast, would you have let the crowd carry on that length of time, or would you have described the scene?
Well, I would have done both. I think because it's radio, I can't leave everybody hanging. So I've got to do something, and that something would be to describe the team celebration on the field with Dennis Martinez and so forth. But I think that I would have waited a few moments. I don't think I would have jumped right in and tried to talk over the crowd. I think we would have let that crowd ride out a little bit, but then I would have turned right away. If Duke and I were doing the game, I would have turned after, say, 15, 20 seconds, maybe 30 seconds. I would have turned to Duke and gotten him involved in the post-game atmosphere down on the field.
So now, as I listened to your call there, and yet, like you pointed out, that was a television broadcast, which is different than a radio broadcast. But I am thinking of now Jerry Howarth, who I've had the pleasure of having over here to talk about his career calling Blue Jay games. And I believe it was the Joey Bats home run in the 7th inning of that wild game against the Rangers, where Jerry, there she goes. And then there is not quite that lengthy, but there's quite a long time. He lets that crowd take it on the radio, and the calls remind me of each other. So there you go.
And the Blue Jays were blessed to have Tom Cheek for all those years. Who was a good friend of mine, as a matter of fact. And I think most of the older Toronto fans know this about Tom Cheek. When Tom was down in Burlington, Vermont, working as a radio broadcaster and doing sports and so forth, we would go down there as part of the winter caravan with the Expos to sell tickets in the Champlain Valley. And Tom was always a part of our luncheons and dinners down there. And as a matter of fact, when the time came for someone to sit in for me on the telecast, I was the one that recommended to John McHale and Jim Fanning that they go after Tom Cheek, and they did. So Tom filled in for me in Montreal before the Blue Jays came into existence, and he went to Toronto, and the rest is history. One of the game's great broadcasters, and one of the best guys ever to sit behind a microphone and do baseball.
Well, that's game recognizing game. I was just about to ask you if you had a relationship with Tom and or Jerry, because that's the soundtrack. So Brian off the top is talking about you're the soundtrack to his summers growing up. Tom and Jerry are the soundtrack to my summers growing up, without a doubt. And we miss Tom Cheek very much.
That's a nice soundtrack.
Yeah, it doesn't get much better than that.
Yeah.
And you do have something in common with Tom Cheek in that you have won the Ford C. Frick Award. That's like a broadcaster getting into Cooperstown, right?
Yeah, essentially it is being honored by Cooperstown. It's the highest honor that a baseball broadcaster can receive, the Ford C. Frick Award.
Well, that's amazing. You got that in 2011, and then Tom Cheek posthumously received that award as well. I'm going to play, speaking of Brian, who called you the soundtrack to his summers, I'm just going to play one more Brian clip, and then we'll talk about some of the players before we talk about what happens to Montreal Expos. So here's Brian again.
The Expos of Montreal really had incredible personalities over the years. The players who embraced the culture and the city loved playing here, and the fans them. How proud are you of Pedro Martinez, who to this day speaks so fondly of the team and just came in recently to a charity event I went to be a part of the 30th anniversary of the 94 Expos? Can you now take from your wallet and show Mike the index card you keep of the 94 Expos 25-man roster, the team with the best record in baseball? Also, which Expo players were you closest to over the years? Do you still stay in touch with any of them? And this also can come from any era you broadcast.
He's giving you orders, Dave.
Wow. some tall orders there. Well, Brian, I can't reach into my wallet and pull out that card that has the Expos numbers on it, only because I'm upstairs in my office. My wallet is downstairs in the safe. Just kidding. It's downstairs on my bureau. So anyway, so I can't show you that at the moment. I would have to take time, go downstairs and.
Right. No, but
it's there. It's there, and it's been there all these years. It's amazing the number of people that I run into from time to time that will ask us, "Can I see that card you carry around in your wallet?" And it takes me, 10 seconds, and I have it to hand to them so they can look at it. And it's just a reminder to me of what a great game this is, and what a great team that was in Montreal. It's just a shame that during all those wonderful years that they only got to the playoffs the one time.
Is 1994 the one that got away? Is that still haunting Expos fanatics?
I think so. I've still, when they ask me, well, what's the best Expos team? When I get that question, I always say 94, and then I emphasize, because your question was the best Expos team. As a team, no Montreal team played any better than that 94 team. And that includes all the years of the superstars, the Rusty Staubs, the Andre Dawsons, and Tim Raines, and Gary Carters, and all of them, Steve Rogers, all of the others. That 94 team was the best team, in my opinion, that the Expos had.
Did you have it's a tough question, I suppose, but were there any Expos in particular that you enjoyed chatting with more than, a typical conversation with a professional athlete? I just wondered who the standouts were.
Sure. I'm still good friends with Steve Rogers. We hit it off when he first came up in what, 73. Yeah, we hit it off at that time, and I always use Steve as an example. I'll say to a baseball fan who will be talking about some pitchers, and I'll say, I will save you having to listen to me about this, but when you get home, go to baseballreference.com and look up Steve Rogers and look at the career that he had as an Expo and the numbers that he put up. It's just incredible to have had a pitcher like that come along. We had others. Pedro Martinez won his first Cy Young Award as a member of the Expos. And unfortunately, the next year he was gone. So there was never a ceremony at the ballpark to honor the Cy Young Award winner. He was something else to watch too. Felipe Alou did such a wonderful job managing him and bringing him along after he came over from the Dodgers and helping to turn him into a magnificent starting pitcher and of course a Hall of Famer. So, but yeah, Steve Rogers and Gary Carter. They both always wound up in the neighborhood. When I was in Montreal, Gary moved to Montreal, and he lived just a few blocks away from me out on the West Island of Montreal in Kirkland. And Steve Rogers did the same. Steve was there. As a matter of fact, Steve Rogers and his family lived in the same apartment buildings that I first moved into with my family in 1969. So we were close friends for a long, long time. And I still get to see Steve a couple of times a year. And we have that kind of friendship that you pick it up where it left off. You feel like I might not have seen him or talked to him in a year. I usually do. We make some phone calls or texts back and forth, but we're just able to pick up the friendship right from the start. And Tommy Hutton's part of that too. He's good friends with Steve.
Amazing, amazing. Now, you don't stay with the Montreal Expos for the entirety of that franchise's existence, because in 2001, you're broadcasting games for the Marlins. So why did you leave Montreal, Dave?
Well, it wasn't my choice. During the 2000 season, when that season started, Jeffrey Loria had taken over as the owner and David Sampson as the president of the ball club. And they were trying to negotiate a rights fee with local radio stations. And they failed at that. And so David thought, well, we'll play the ace card. We'll tell the business here, the radio business, that we're not going to do the games on the radio unless they come up with a rights fee. And so he called me into the office and he said, this was the 2000 season. He said, we're not doing the games in English. And he said, if you want to look elsewhere, your contract expires at the end of this season, but you have our permission right now to look elsewhere for a job. So that was the way things came down. I wound up doing most of the 2000 season on the internet. And so I think I might still be the first broadcaster to broadcast an entire season or most of the entire season on the internet. So when that ended, my career with Montreal was over. In the meantime, I had learned that there was going to be an opening in Florida. I had made my home in Florida since 1984, moved from Montreal to South Florida. So my home was here, and I heard there was going to be an opening with the Florida Marlins, and I immediately went to work on that because I knew the boss there. I knew David Dombrowski from his days in Montreal, and I had a meeting with David Dombrowski. He had me meet with their marketing people, and before that 2000 season was over, I had the job in South Florida for starting in 2001.
in 2003, you get to call a World Series championship. So
Yep.
what was that like?
Well, it was an absolute thrill. It was a thrilling playoff schedule of games, and it was a thrill to do that and to actually win the World Series by beating the New York Yankees on their turf in the Bronx. And it's a memory that stays with me to this day. When that game was over, of course, all of the families that had traveled with the Expos, or rather with the Marlins, came down on the field. And my daughter was 3 years old at the time, Madison. And so I said, Maddie, come with me. And I took her by the hand and I went to home plate, talked to her about home plate. And this was where it all happened. And we walked the bases. We walked the first to second to third and home. And that memory sticks out with me forever. She was 3 years old at the time. She's now 24.
Wow.
I can't believe that. Madison is now 24 years old, and she lives here just south of West Palm Beach in Delray Beach.
Nice. Now, Dave, do they give you a ring if you call the World Series?
Yes. I have the same. And I'll say this as a tribute to Valoria and Sampson. They gave the broadcasters the same ring.
Wow.
It was not a cut down version of the ring. It was the same ring that the players and front office staff, ownership, and so forth received. So I still have that, of course.
No, Dave, we're winding down here. I just want to tell you how much I've enjoyed this. Like, I think I've taken an hour of your life here, and I've got a couple more points I want to hit before we say goodbye. But I want to say thank you so much that you agreed to do this. And again, teaser for the listenership, we might be hearing more Dave Van Horne later in June 2024. So thanks so much for doing this.
Mike, it's been my pleasure. I appreciate the invitation, and I'm looking forward to coming back with you and looking forward to having to spend some time, albeit on a web call with Leslie Taylor. So
Awesome.
We'll look forward to that. And again, I thank you very much.
Now, from that positive note, we're going to go a little sad here, because on September 29th, 2004, as luck would have it, you're calling the final home game in Expos history from the visiting radio booth. Like, what were the odds, right? But you're there to call the final home game. And as I recall, we didn't know for sure, but we knew, right? Like, it was one of those, this is probably it.
Yeah.
Tell me what it was like to call the final out in that game on September 29th, 2004.
Well, there were a lot of tears that day, and not just in the Expos booths, TV and radio, but also brought a tear to my eye as well, because we were all convinced this was the end. This was the last game, and it was a sad day. I remember after we left the air, walking out of the booth, and I walked right into Claude Raymond, and he could hardly speak, with tears streaking down his face, and it's in a way it's ironic, because my absolute number one start in my Expos career, April 8th, 1969, standing during the anthems next to Russ Taylor, and I turned to Russ, and he had tears running down his face prior to that first game at Shea Stadium.
Will the Expos ever return to Montreal? You don't have a crystal ball. I won't hold you to this. I'm just wondering what your educated guess would be on this one.
Well, I know this. For Expos fans of a certain age who have been through a lot with that franchise, that whether or not the team physically comes back or not, it will never leave, because it's in the hearts of so many Montrealers, Quebecers, and Canadians.
That's true. And we've heard from a couple today, and there were many more, but many people missing the Expos, and maybe one day they will return. We do not know, but we know you're, as we mentioned off the top, you're retired. So I'm just curious, why did you retire? You call baseball games for a living. Why not do that forever?
Well, it was time. It was time, and things behind the scenes in South Florida were changing. Several ownership changes, and things were not headed in a positive direction, and it was time to move on. Heading into my last season of broadcasting, pretty much a full schedule, 2021, I thought to myself, I'd like to do a year or two more. But that was taken away when the offer that they made for me to stay here, the offer that came from the front office here, was just not an offer that an experienced, established major league broadcaster would be able to accept. And so my last words to them over the phone, because they never met with me physically, but over the phone, my last words were, if this is your last offer, I would sooner retire than accept this offer. And as a matter of fact, I got a little strong there. I said, you should be ashamed of the offer that you've made to me. And that was the end of my conversation with them, and I've never heard from them since.
Good for you. Seriously, good for you. Look, you're in the Hall of Fame, for goodness sakes, right?
Yes, and very proud of that. Very proud of that. I am proud of my body of work. 53 years in the major leagues and 56 years in professional baseball, because I always count the 3 years that I did minor league ball in Richmond with the Richmond Braves.
Well, Canadian Baseball Hall of Fame, Ford C. Frick Award, and now you're an FOTM, a friend of Toronto Mike. That's the trifecta. Dave Van Horne, I loved this so much. Thanks for doing this.
Mike, it was my pleasure. We'll do it again.